Thank you so much, Acting Director Fowler, for your testimony. I want to remind the members that Committee Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask the witnesses. I will now turn to Representative McCullum to begin with the questions she may have for our witness.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you for holding this hearing. I'm assuming I've got the mute button all taken care of here. Thank you for holding the hearing, Madam Chair, on this advanced appropriations. This is a piece of legislation, as you pointed out, our dear colleague Don Young worked very hard. And he worked on Indian issues in a nonpartisan way, not just a bipartisan way, a nonpartisan way. And he, as you pointed out, was one of the strongest champions for Indian country. As a former chair and current vice chair of the Interior Appropriations Subcommittee, which funds the Health and Indian Health Service, I've heard from tribal leaders for years about the difficulty of operating essential government services under the uncertainty of continuing resolutions and shutdowns. And I want to thank you for having this hearing, Madam Chair. I had a listening during the government shutdown between 2018 and 2019, and the stories that were shared were heartbreaking and at times horrifying to listen to what was going on in Indian country. So I thank you and this committee for holding a hearing on this topic last Congress about in 2019 when that was held. So let me just say that the federal government has a responsibility, a sacred responsibility, to fulfill the central trust and treaty responsibilities in healthcare services to Native Americans. So we pointed out that these shutdowns put a spotlight on the clear need for advanced appropriations. Ms. Fowler, you outlined many of the harms caused in your testimony, the lasting impacts that it has on staff not feeling appreciated, secure in their jobs. Is there anything else you would like to add about what happened during the shutdown in 2019? And how, if anything, you want to add to the uncertainty and how this impacts morale, recruitment, and detention, and what it does to the trauma in communities. And the last part I'd ask you is, IHS has been able to learn from the VA. I was here when the VA finally went to advanced appropriations, because our veterans used to get caught in the same dilemma that our tribal elders and our tribal youth are caught in. So have you been able to take lessons learned from the VA so that you'll be able to hit the ground running when we are able to pass this advanced appropriations?
Thank you for your words and your statements. I would like to just note that recruitment and retention is already is a challenge for the Indian Health Service at any point in time. But during any time of budget uncertainty, it worsens. It becomes a greater challenge for us. The inability to do job offers to providers, to approve loaner payments, to approve incentives, recruitment incentives or retention incentives, the inability to establish a start date for a new recruit or to ensure that we are going to be able to pay for their moving expenses, all lead to the loss of potential great employees for the Indian Health Service. And so that is a particular challenge. There's also the challenge of not being able to pay our vendors. And so we've had vendors who stop doing business with the Indian Health Service because we're unable to pay them during a government shutdown. So these are definitely huge and significant impacts that we see arising from budget uncertainty. Regarding the VA, we actually have sat down and talked with them about their budgeting process. We know that they use a fairly complex method for estimating and projecting their budget needs. I think one of the things that we have learned from them is that an approach to executing or implementing advanced appropriations would likely be best accomplished through a two-phase process. And that process would consist of phase one, or the year one budget request for advance appropriations focused on the current services level of funding, while the second phase would be the point in time at which the proposals and the priorities for the administration would be outlined and identified.
Thank you, Ms. Fowler. Thank you again, Madam Chair, for holding this hearing and for the ranking member being here and being part of this important discussion.
Thank you. The chair will now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Ms. Fowler, thank you very much for your testimony. As you know, in 2017, the GAO placed the IHS on its high-risk list, and earlier, several months ago, when the GAO updated that list, the IHS remains there. We had a hearing in the subcommittee several weeks ago in which we discussed the status of the various recommendations that the GAO had made and how far along the IHS was in implementing them. Just to be transparent here, some of the criticism that we get when we suggest authorizing advance appropriations for IHS is that that would cut Congress too far out of the loop in holding IHS accountable for implementing the remaining recommendations and getting off the GAO's high-risk list. Could you give us an update on the status of the implementation of those remaining recommendations? And could you also talk a little bit about whether or not you feel that authorizing these advance appropriations would diminishes Congress's ability to oversee the removal of IHS from that list?
Sure. It's a great question, and I appreciate the opportunity to say a few words about that. So as far as the GAO's high-risk list is concerned, the Indian Health Service, as you noted, was placed on the list in 2017, or since 2017, and there were a number of recommendations that were identified as being unaddressed. I know that the overarching reason that IHS was placed on the list is because the GAO found that the Health Service was performing inadequate oversight over the health care that was being provided to American Indians and Alaska Natives. IHS has worked very hard to address the recommendations, and at this point in time, I can tell you that there are 6 recommendations that remain open. 2 of those recommendations, the Indian Health Service has requested to be closed as implemented. We're just waiting for confirmation from GAO on those recommendations. And we've also developed an action plan that we've had one discussion with GAO about. They provided us feedback, but this action plan is actually designed to lead to removal from the high-risk list by identifying 11 actions that we intend to accomplish by June of 2023. And all of these actions have the effect of establishing improvements in systems or processes that will be sustainable for the years to come, so we're able to ensure that the improvements will be sustained. And
Ms. Fowler, if I could just ask you to provide that answer as a written response to the committee. I'd like to leave some time for you to answer the second part of the question, which is whether or not granting this advance appropriations authority would diminish our ability to oversee IHS getting off that list. I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Thank you again. Really, as I mentioned just a minute ago, we believe that the best approach might be a two-phased approach to implementing advance appropriations, which means that we would be submitting a budget request every year, as we currently do, and we would be committed, we are committed to ensuring that we will be responsive to any continuing requests from the committee during the in-between years, but by submitting a budget request every year, we do believe that that maintains the process for that oversight and ability to have us testify really on or provide briefings on our activities and our programs.
Right. Well, thank you. As you and I have discussed before, we don't view this as an adversarial relationship. We want to empower you and make sure that you have the tools and the resources that you need to get off this list, because in doing that, it would serve not only the IHS, but also the constituents that rely on you. So thank you for the testimony. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. The chair would now like to recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Ranking Member, and of course the witnesses for joining us today. Indigenous communities have historically been shortchanged when it comes to receiving high-quality health care to meet their needs. And the COVID-19 pandemic, which hit Native Americans especially hard, makes providing certainty for healthcare funding even more important. Not only are Indigenous communities receiving less funding than what they need, it often doesn't arrive in time. Chronic appropriations delays, piecemeal funding bills, and government shutdowns have hampered the ability of Indian Health Service to deliver the healthcare and services these communities rely on. Plain and simple, one's health shouldn't depend on Congress's ability or inability to pass legislation on time. A question for Ms. Fowler. In your testimony, you mentioned that urban Indian organizations are disproportionately affected by disruptions in federal appropriations. Why is this the case, and how do these disruptions impact communities on the ground?
Really great question. Urban Indian organizations are funded through a different mechanism than our tribal health programs. They're funded through contracts and grants, and the contracts are federal acquisitions regulation contracts. One reason that they're disproportionately impacted is that during a continuing resolution, we're able to pay tribal programs whose contracts or compacts have start dates within the continuing resolution period, their full year funding through an exception apportionment process. We are unable to do this for the urban Indian organizations. And so they receive funding for partial amount that's consistent with the continuing resolution period, which, so it's a piecemeal funding method for those programs. Go ahead.
Thank you. You also mentioned that a lapse in appropriations has led to concerns from potential recruits and existing staff, especially healthcare providers, about the stability of their employment. How has the lapse of funding impacted recruitment and the future health workforce in Native communities?
So the lapse of appropriations, during a lapse in appropriations, we are unable to perform certain functions, and of course we don't have appropriated funding to spend. So spending is either severely curtailed or it's stopped altogether. For our providers and for our workforce, we are unable to, for new recruits, make job offers. We're unable to approve Title 38 salaries for our doctors and dentists. We are unable to approve any of the incentives that we have authorities for: recruitment, relocation, and retention. we are unable to enter into any long-term commitments. We're often unable to enter into some of the support contracts that make their jobs easier as well. And so it really creates a lot of stress on our workforce. And for those who do not receive a paycheck, it creates a hardship for them. Oftentimes, our staff commute long distances, and so the inability to, or the uncertainty about receiving a paycheck means they're not sure if they're going to have enough money to pay for gas, to pay for childcare, or just to pay for basic subsistence like groceries or their utilities.
Thank you so much for painting a picture of all the things that hamper your ability to deliver more quality healthcare and to run a more sustainable organization. I reserve the rest of my questions for the second panel. Again, thank you.
Thank you. The chair would now like to recognize the gentleman from Montana, Representative Rosendale.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Acting Director Fowler, thank you so much for joining us today. I do appreciate that. I'm going to go down the same line of questioning that the rank or Obernolte was on, and that is, what oversight or additional checks and balances have you put in place to assure proper and timely use of the funds to avoid the waste, fraud, and mismanagement, which has caused the IHS designation as a high-risk program? And what I'm trying to determine is whether the action plan with the 11 actions that you were talking about, is that basically for monitoring funds after distribution so that you can track what's going on, or is that to provide more stringent oversight and accountability at the actual release of those funds? So if you could walk us through that and let us know if it's monitoring after, or what checks and balances are in place to make sure that these funds are being used properly.
Great question. First of all, I just want to point out that the GAO's designation of the Indian Health Service as a high-risk agency is really focused on the oversight of healthcare. It's not specifically identified that fraud, waste, and abuse or mismanagement of funds is at the heart of that. And indeed, we've not identified that as an issue. However, we do believe that part of adequate oversight over healthcare that's being provided does include additional insight into how funding is allocated and spent below the headquarters level. And so the action plan does include an action that would help us to have more oversight over funding that is spent at our hospitals and health clinics. So it really does, it's something that's going to occur after the funds are allocated.
Okay, so it's focused more on monitoring after the distribution of those funds. Is that fair to say?
Yes, although I should add that part of that, it also includes an approvals level so that there's an additional oversight prior to the funds being spent.
Okay, so it's my understanding that, well, I'll tell you what, are there specific accounts that you believe are the most important to have advance appropriations in? In other words, what accounts do you place the highest priority on that need to be funded in advance of others? Have you broken that down?
So we believe that because our system is very much integrated and interconnected, that it's important for our entire set of accounts to receive advance appropriations.
Okay, so let me ask you this. Can you, it's my understanding that IHS has stated its systems in place to accommodate receiving the advance appropriations, okay, this money in advance. Can you further elaborate on that system?
Sure. Well, we believe that we are well prepared to implement advanced appropriations. There are two primary functions that would be impacted. One is our ability to account for the funds in our accounting system. So that is the system where we would need to modify in order to identify the funding for a budget year in advance of the current budget year. And so we are well prepared to do that. The other function that is impacted is budget formulation in terms of identifying estimates a year in advance of when we normally do it. And we are well prepared to initiate that work. As I mentioned before, I think I mentioned it previously, that our budget formulation process begins with tribal consultation. And so we are well prepared to begin this and implement those functions appropriately.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you. The chair will now recognize the chair of the Natural Resources Committee, the gentleman from Arizona, Representative Gallego.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair and Ranking Member. First, let me just get some business out of the way and submit for the record, Madam Chair, letters of support for Mr. Young's legislation, and from the joint letter to Congress from the Indian Health Care, and then the resolution that National Congress of American Indians passed specific to the issue that we're dealing with here today, advanced appropriations, the American Bar Association resolution and support, and the United South and Eastern Tribes Incorporated, their resolution in support of the legislation.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. You know, every time there's a governmental shutdown, disruption in the flow of the resources the resources that our government and our federal agents that are responsible for, the tribes receive the brunt end of that process, and the government fails to uphold its treaty and trust obligations. That's happened more than once in my tenure here, and the most adverse consequence by far was an Indian country and around a lot of issues, but focused in on healthcare. And you know, I understand the White House supports advanced appropriations as an essential bridge, and it makes sense. Like was pointed out, the Veterans Administration went through that process, having to deal with the same issues that Indian Country Health Services is doing. And I recall it was around the same issues: patient quality, retention, employment issues, human resource issues, facility upgrade issues, all brought to us by veteran organizations representing their members and saying something's got to change. And what changed is advanced. But beyond that, for a decade, the investment in veterans' health increased dramatically. And, you know, that's part of the issue here. And I appreciate the question that the ranking member brought up about accountability, Madam Chair. Maybe that's something to explore. You know, I'm the last one to want to tamper with Mr. Young's legislation. But if there is some specificity that is not onerous above and beyond to Indian Health Service, that reaffirms the role I think the ranking member was trying to make a point of, reaffirms this committee's oversight role, I think that language, if there could be agreement, would be a pretty good thing, and I think would allay some concerns of where this committee will stand with advanced approaches. And I agree that the Veterans Administration, like I said, took a decade to integrate that investment, go through the bumps of having to implement a new system, but through that whole time, that committee was involved in that with much oversight and accountability extended. It didn't end the resource flow, but it, I think, helped make sure that the system itself was getting better. And I think that that's what we want to do here, is make it more efficient. And if there's a role, Madam Chair, leave that to you folks' discretion on that. I really don't have any questions. Just wanted to, other than Director Fowler, so the administration, I assume or presume, both are dangerous. the that they're okay with codifying this advanced process into law, the advanced appropriations into law. Am I correct?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
And yeah, and I was just mad to the chair's comments. I think this would be a fitting thing. I know the chair and the ranking member, myself and others, and we're still pursuing, I think what would be not just a memorial for the man, but also I think a plus for Indian countries to put together the legislations that have been the work of this committee, and you guys have done a lot of work, and those that are pending on the floor and those that are pending in the Senate, and urge a package approval at some point before the sun sets on this session, and I'll look to your leadership on how you want to do that. Thank you. Now you're back.
Thank you, Chair Grijalva. And I do think that we have been having discussions with our colleagues about how to properly honor our ranking member and former Dean of the House and his commitment to issues like
And
what
don't
we are.
forget, former boss too. You know,
Oh, he was a
who
former.
ran this place.
And we can't forget the amazing salmon and black cod we were able to enjoy in his presence. So I do think that we do intend to continue, and I look forward to having the bipartisan support for recognizing, his legacy and naming, putting it on the name of these bills, right? So we have some work ahead of us to be able to do that and honor that, and I am very grateful for the support that we've been hearing about putting that, and it's like nonpartisan, as Representative McCollum said. It is simply the right thing to do. After that many years of service, it is the way we honor. We honor not just by words, but it is deeds that make the difference. And I think that the deed of actually having a package that honors Representative Young, with this being a key part of it. I will now recognize myself for questions. Director Fowler, you've answered questions about the impact that not having advanced funding has done in terms of employees, in terms of morale, in terms of the difficulty of subcontracting. I wanted to kind of take this a little further and ask, how has it impacted in two areas? One would be the ability to plan, right? Every other health business out there or health facility can think about what is our future? What do we need to be ready for? How do we address the fact that a pandemic occurred and we have different problems that we need to think about in terms of what our facilities look like? And so I wanted to have you talk a little bit about how this yearly and kind of jerk on, jerk off, there is nothing smooth about our budgeting process for you now, how that affects planning. And then if you could do also, I know that so many of our patients that go to the IHS, sometimes you don't have the specialty that they need, and so they must get their care elsewhere. There must be the contract services, the support services. Are you aware of patients, IHS entitled patients, who were unable to get the care they needed because of the problems with regards to not having that advance appropriations? You ran out of money and you just don't have the money until we pass another our budget so that they can get the care outside of the IHS system itself. If you could address those two aspects. And then I do have another question and observation before my 5 minutes is up.
Yes, again, the budget uncertainty makes it very difficult for our programs. The budget formulation process actually works well up until that very last step of receiving a full year appropriation for the agency. It's really that last step that impacts our programs significantly because of their inability to make long-term commitments, their ability to plan beyond whether it's a continuing resolution period. They can't plan beyond that because that future is unknown. And so that means that any decisions that need to be made about some of those longer term commitments, whether it's a contract, which because of certain regulations, and we have to be able to enter into the full year amount of contracts when we enter and obligate it at the time that we enter into it. And so it creates difficulties in that regard. It creates difficulties, as I mentioned before, with recruitment and retention, procurements as well. It can significantly impact our ability to obtain the supplies and services that we need to provide healthcare. And so that final step, that lack of an appropriation and waiting for that process to complete really creates some difficulties for us. And then the second part of your question, sorry, it just went out of my head.
It was I think you've provided just, I mean, it is like anything we can think of that a business and a health facility would need to do, you can't do because you don't know how much money you're going to get, and the money runs out, and we're in a continuing resolution. I just want to echo Representative McCollum's comments about when we speak with tribal leaders, and I'd like to recognize that we have tribal leaders in the hearing with us today, and they all tell us over and over again about the need to have advanced appropriations. I was at the Gallup Indian Medical Center, which is one of the busiest IHS facilities in the country, as well as one of the oldest. We will hear from President Nez a little later. But when I asked the tribal leaders, the staff, everybody who we were interacting with on that day and the other days that I've gone to our facilities, what can we do? Advance appropriations comes up over and over again because the negative impacts just cascade down. So with that, I want to thank our witnesses in our first panel. Oh, Ms. Radaragan has arrived? Okay, great. We will give us a few seconds and a little bit of patience so we can have our Representative Radaragan be recognized for 5 minutes as she... Okay, well, we will have our second panel, and hopefully Representative... Oh, there we go. We do know that the acting director must leave at 2 o'clock, so this is the exact perfect timing, and the chair will recognize Representative Radaragan for 5 minutes, or until 2 o'clock, which should coincide.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to yield my time to the ranking member.
Thank you very much to the member for yielding. Before you go, Ms. Fowler, I'm sure that you reviewed the testimony from the coming panel. One of the pieces of testimony that I found was pretty compelling was the testimony of Chairman Erickson from the Colville tribes when he was talking about the difficulties that they've had with IHS and particularly as a direct service tribe, the difficulties that they've had with IHS's management of PRC and third-party billing. And I know it's a little awkward here because we've got you and they in different panels, so we're going to hear from Chairman Erickson in just a minute here. But I wonder if you could respond to that and talk a little bit about whether or not this is a widespread issue with other direct service tribes in the IHS system, and some of the tools maybe that we have to solve these problems.
Yes, and actually, I am aware of the issues that the Colville tribe has raised. They've raised them to me, and we have undertaken some work to identify what it is occurring there in that area and with that program. I'll just say, as far as it being widespread, I'm not aware that there are issues elsewhere. I will say that one common factor for purchase and referred care programs is purchase and referred care funding has led us to, we're not able to fund all of the purchase and referred care needs that are out there. And so it resulted in IHS establishing regulations that limit the eligibility for purchased and referred care services. And so the amount of funding resources really has a large part to do with some of the issues related to referrals not being approved for care because they don't meet the medical priorities that are established, as an example, or because the patient doesn't reside in the eligibility area. And so this is something that we're very much aware of, and that entire program is where we purchase healthcare from vendors outside of the Indian Health Service, and so it is one that is very dependent on financial resources.
Right.
If my colleague would yield for a minute, this is Congresswoman McCollum.
Yes, I will yield.
So, Ms. Fowler, I think what you're alluding to is the fact that quite often through appropriations, something that I've worked very hard in with Mr. Cole, Mr. Simpson, other appropriators, is not having up-to-date computer systems, not having access to broadband, not having the contractors available to help to train in the trainers on how to work some of these programs and do some of the competitive work that needs to be done. Mr. Obenroti, I was just shocked at a hearing that I had about 4 years ago, and one of our tribal systems was still using DOS. So part of it just doesn't fall on the heroic work that the healthcare providers are trying to do. It falls on Congress not doing its job in fulfilling its obligation for systems, computer systems, as well as facilities. And that's part of the reason why you see the reports that you do from GAO. So we have our own work to do. And I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I return his time.
Well, thank you. Very worthwhile contribution. Before you go, Ms. Fowler, if you and I were discussing a few minutes ago the budget process and the budget process that would be followed under advance appropriations, could you talk a little bit about the current involvement of the tribes in the budget process? I know you've got budget advisory committees, but I know that there's been talk about making it more transparent and accessible to the tribes. How do you see that progressing in the future?
Tribal consultation is fundamental to our budget process. Everything that we do is based on the set of budget priorities that the tribes generate and agree on as part of our budget formulation process. I think that being able to identify through advance appropriations, making funding more predictable would allow us to have more fulsome discussions around what the needs are going to be and estimating and projecting budget needs 1 year out. And so I think it really would be helpful to us to have those discussions, and certainly that there is still the deliberative process that means that we're not able to be transparent about what happens during that phase of the budget, but we would use every opportunity to talk about the budget, given those parameters that we already have in place for the budget process.
Great. Well, thank you. I know you have a schedule constraint. I thank you for answering the question and sticking around. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member, and thank you, Director Fowler. And, you know, we would note that those issues around Congress's obligation to fully fund, we did have that funding in the Build Back Better legislation. I think we need to always remember that that legislation tried to address the underfunding, the chronic underfunding, and what we needed to do to bring our facilities up to the modern day. So we will continue to look at those, and through the regular appropriations process, hopefully increase and address the needs. I will now like to transition to our second panel of witnesses for today. Before introducing them, I will remind non-administration witnesses that they are encouraged to participate in the Witness Diversity Survey created by the Congressional Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Witnesses may refer to their hearing invitation materials for further information. Under our committee rules, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but you may submit a longer statement for the record if you choose. When you begin, the on-screen timer will begin counting down and will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining. I recommend that members and witnesses joining remotely lock the timer on the screen. When you go over the allotted time, I will gently tap my gavel and kindly ask you to please wrap up your statement. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid inadvertent background noise. I will allow the entire panel to testify before we begin the question portion of the hearing. I would now like to recognize the Honorable Jonathan Nez, who is President of the Navajo Nation and the Navajo Area Representative for the National Indian Health Board. I am honored to have you join our committee here today, President Nez. You're now recognized.